Okay, everybody. Hi. Time to get started. I hope everyone is well. We're going to be continuing with the Kuzari in essay number 3 for the first few minutes of our shir today. And then we're going to be studying Parshas Chayei, and we'll get our message across, hopefully, and maybe be able to create a bridge between the two subjects. We are studying the Kuzari towards the end of the third essay of the Kuzari, where Rebbi Yehuda Halevi is going through a long list of Tanaim first, rabbis of the Mishnaic period. Let me just mute everybody. Rabbis of the Mishnaic period, that's where we're up to right now. And we are in the transition in our list of sages, where last week we talked about the Sanhedrin, because this was a governing body of rabbis that were extant during the Second Temple and a little bit beyond the Second Temple period. And now we're going back to our discussion of individual sages, and we are on page 374 in the Kuzari, subparagraph 11, where Rebbi Yehuda Halevi says afterwards, which means after the destruction of the temple and after the dismantling of the Sanhedrin, came Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Yossi HaGalili and their colleagues, and they all lived after the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, before we get into the uniqueness of Rabbi Akiva, which is really the main thrust of this paragraph, to talk about how Rabbi Akiva was able to reach near prophetic levels. And again, this is to bolster the argument that the sages who were entrusted with the responsibility of perpetuating our oral tradition were people not only of great righteousness and integrity, but also people who reached near prophetic levels and were able to intuit the will of Hashem because of their great holiness. And this is, again, the disputation and the refutation of the Karaites, who sought to belittle and deconstruct the rabbinic tradition. But before we get to that discussion of Rabbi Akiva, what I'd like to point out is that there's a bridge that needs to be constructed between the generation that lived through the destruction of the Second Temple and this new generation that Rebbi Yehuda Halevi is describing, which is the generation of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. Now, I do want to mention that Rebbi Yehuda Halevi does believe, it appears that he believes, that there's two Rabbi Yossis, because in a couple of weeks ago, we had also seen him quote a Rabbi Yossi on the previous page, who was one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. There are some people who believe that that Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, who is mentioned as one of the 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is none other than Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. But apparently Rebbi Yehuda Halevi believes that it's 2 Rabbi Yossis, but that's just a small tangential point. And to really get across what I'd like to present to you today about this new generation of rabbis is to sort of portray for you 2 pieces of Mishnaic text that will sort of show you where we are in Jewish history. So allow me to share my screen with you for this morning. And let me, whoops, it's the wrong one. I'll bring it up now. Here we are. I hope everyone can see it. It's called The Generation of Rebbi Akiva and the Changing Tides After the Churban. And I want to get across a very specific message by just juxtaposing 2 texts with you. First of all, just to show you the overlap that exists between the generation of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students and the generation of Rabbi Akiva, even though Rebbi Yehuda Halevi portrays them as 2 separate generations, let's note something quite interesting. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, in chapter 2, says, Chamisha Talmidim hayu Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And as we've discussed in previous weeks, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was very much alive during the Second Temple period. He lives through the Churban, and many of you recall that story, how he was smuggled out of Jerusalem during the Roman siege, okay? And he was able to perpetuate Judaism by preserving the town of Yavne and by sending out his students and making sure that they perpetuated Judaism after the destruction. And also he enacted many rabbinic laws, many rabbinic takanot, to create a remembrance of the Second Temple after its destruction. So when we look at the 5 students that are listed of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we note that 2 of them are Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinis and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. The other 3 are Rabbi Yossi, Reb Shimon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Okay, now, but I want us to focus on the first 2, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Let's go now to another Mishnaic text. It is not found in the Mishnah, but it is found in the Haggadah, because the Haggadah, the origins of the Haggadah of Pesach, are from Mishnaic times. And the Haggadah relates the following story. Ma'aseh b'Rabbi Eliezer, v'Rabbi Yehoshua. These are the same Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua who are the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. They may have been alive during the destruction of the Second Temple. It stands to reason that they were, but they may have been just young men during this time. V'Rebbi Elazar ben Azariah, v'Rebbi Akiva, v'Rebbi Tarfon. Now these are not listed. These latter 3 are not listed as the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, probably because they are younger than Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. We know for a fact from a historical record that Rabbi Akiva is much younger than Rabbi Eliezer. As a matter of fact, he considers Rabbi Eliezer his Rebbe, as the Gemara in Bava Metzia relates that when Rabbi Eliezer had to be put into Cherem, had to be put under a rabbinic ban for dissenting from the majority ruling of his colleagues, it was Rabbi Akiva, the student, who was sent to inform him of this news. So Rabbi Akiva is a colleague, but he's a junior colleague of Rabbi Eliezer. And it's also important to note that Rabbi Akiva lives into the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which took place in approximately the year 132 of the Common Era, which is over 60 years after the destruction of the temple. So if that's the case, Rabbi Akiva may or may not have been alive at the time of the destruction. If he was alive, he must have been very young, and he certainly was not Rebbi Akiva at that time, because as we know, Rabbi Akiva only became Rabbi Akiva after the age of 40, is when he began his studies. So Rabbi Akiva is really not involved with, in any real sense, with experiencing the destruction of the temple, probably has not been involved at all with the Second Temple period. Either he was born afterwards, or even if he was alive during the Second Temple, because he was not one of the rabbinic community, probably either himself had never been to the Second Temple or was too young to have any recollection of it. And I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. But the elder sages, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, are alive during the times of the Second Temple. They are the key disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who helped their teacher reconstruct Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. But in our Haggadah story, these 5 sages are reclining, Shayu Mesubin Bivnei Brak. Already you see that there's no longer a temple, and there's been a dispersion of Jewry outside of Yerushalayim, and they're in the Bnei Brak community. V'hayu misaprim b'yitziat Mitzrayim kol oto halayla. And they were discussing the Exodus for that entire night. Ad shabou talmidehem ve'amru lahem, until their students came to them and said to them, Rabotenu, higia zaman kriyat shema shel shacharit. Our masters, the time to recite Kriyat Shema has arrived. Now, just Rabbi Tarfon is also in this list. So we have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who eventually becomes the Nasi sort of the chief rabbi of the Jewish people, the chief rabbinic leader of the Jewish people, after the story with Rabbi Gamliel that we studied a couple of weeks ago. If you recall, Rabbi Gamliel was in a dispute with Rabbi Yehoshua, his colleague, over rabbinic authority, and they had a dispute as to when Yom Kippur would fall out that year. Rabbi Gamliel ordered Rabbi Yehoshua to appear before him on the day that Rabbi Yehoshua calculated was Yom Kippur, and to actively desecrate what for him was Yom Kippur, because Rabbi Gamliel felt he needed to unify all of world Jewry to one calendar system. And eventually he abused Rabbi Yehoshua so much that the rest of the rabbinic community ostracized and dethroned Rabbi Gamliel from his post, and they instated Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in his stead, at least temporarily. So we know Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is also a younger colleague of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. He's a young man at the time that they instate him as the Nasi. Okay, so, and then Rabbi Tarfon is also an interesting person in that we're not, even though Rabbi Yehuda Halevi mentions him as part of his list of the next generation, but let's look at a very interesting story that is recorded in the Midrash. The Midrash, in source number 3, is discussing the laws of the Chatzotzrot. The Chatzotzrot is something that's discussed in Parshat Bahalotcha. It is, the word literally means the trumpets. They are silver trumpets that the Torah commands should be fashioned as part of the accoutrements of the Mishkan and later on in the temple. And the Torah gives us very specific instructions as to when and how to blow these trumpets. They're meant for assemblies. They're meant to let the people know about joyous occasions and also about sad occasions when there's a need for fasting. And the Medrash tells us, this is a halachic Medrash, so it teaches us halacha, and it says that when the Torah says that the Kohanim are charged with blowing the trumpets, there's a dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva as to which kind of Kohen is qualified to blow these trumpets. Everyone with me so far? So you have HaKohanim, Bein Tmimim, Bein Ba'alei Mumim, Divrei Rabbi Tarfon. We know that in order for a Kohen to do the sacrificial service in the temple, the Kohen cannot have any physical deformities or disabilities. Okay, that's a rule that the Kohen must be physically fit and cannot have a missing limb, cannot be hunchbacked or have other kinds of physical disabilities. We're not going to go into the reasons right now, but that's one of the requirements in order for a Kohen to do the sacrificial service, to bring the korbanot. Now, here, Rabbi Tarfon says, but when it comes to blowing the trumpets, that requirement of being a tamim, of being unblemished, does not apply. If you are a Kohen who has a physical disability, you are still kosher to blow the trumpets. Rabbi Akiva Omer, tamimim velo ba'alei mumim. Rabbi Akiva says no. The Kohen must be unblemished, just as if he's doing the sacrificial service. Just like a Kohen doing the sacrificial service must be unblemished, so too a Kohen doing the sacrificial service must blowing the trumpets must be unblemished. And how do I know this? So he goes through a whole exegetical teaching about how he learns it from the psukim. And then comes, and I'll skip that for now, just for reasons of brevity. So once Rebbe Tarfon hears Rebbe Akiva's argument, Amar le Rebbe Tarfon, ad matai megavev umevi aleinu, Akiva, ad matai megavev umevi aleinu, Akiva eini yochol lisbol. He says, if I'm reading it correctly, how much longer is this person going to have to be gathering and heaping things upon us? Akiva, I can't tolerate this any longer. In other words, he's complaining against Rebbe Akiva. You're bringing me proof because of your exegetical derivations from the psukim. You know, there's nothing better than being an eyewitness to what happened in the temple. Akapeach et banai im lo ra'iti Shimon achi ima shahaya chiger biraglo echat shahaya omed umeria b'chatzotrot. He says, my half-brother, whose name was Shimon, he was a Kohen, and he was alive during the Second Temple period, and I witnessed with my own eyes that my half-brother Shimon the Kohen, who was handicapped, blew the trumpets. So Akiva, I accept the fact that you've got a brilliant mind and that you're able to bring me exegetical proof from the verses that only an unblemished Kohen may blow the trumpets, but I saw with my own eyes in the Second Temple, my half-brother who was a Kohen, who was also disabled, blowing the trumpets. So stop, as we say in yeshiva, stop hocking me a chinik, right? Stop making us all crazy with your exegetical derivations. So the story doesn't end there. Omar lo hein Rebbi shema bahakel ra'ita sheba'alei mumin sherin bahakel uviyom hakippurim uviyovel. So Rebbi Akiva very patiently said, yes, Rebbe, I accept your testimony. But is it perhaps possible that when your half-brother Shimon blew the trumpets, it was on a special occasion at the time of Hakel, which is done once every 7 years when all the people are gathered together to hear the king read the Sefer Torah, or perhaps it was on the Yom Kippur of Yovel, when they blow the trumpets to proclaim emancipation of all slaves. He says, in those two unique circumstances, which are done infrequently, a Kohen who is a Balmum, who is disabled, is permitted to blow the trumpets. But what I'm referring to is on a regular basis, when it comes to blowing the trumpets during the bringing of korbanot and in other periodical events, you may not allow a Kohen who is disabled to blow the trumpets. So Rabbi Tarfon hears his argument, and he says, Amar le ha'avodah shelo bidita. Rabbi Tarfon catches himself, and after hurling this sharp criticism at Rabbi Akiva previously, he says, you know something? You are 100% correct, Rabbi Akiva. Ashrecha Avraham Avinu sheyatza mechalatzecha Akiva. Fortunate are you, Avraham, our patriarch, that descended from you comes the great Rebbe Akiva. Now, it's fascinating if you note this language. Why does he say, fortunate are you, Avraham Avinu, that from your loins issued Rebbe Akiva? Some of you may be aware that Rebbe Akiva is descended from converts, at least a portion of his lineage. And we know that Avraham Avinu is the father of all converts. And so perhaps that's the reason why he proclaimed it in this way. In other words, even though Rebbe Akiva, you may have not been part of the rabbinic community your entire life, you may not have the greatest yichus, but you're still part of the mishpacha, and fortunate is Avraham, who has such a descendant such as you. Tarfon ra'a v'shachach, Akiva doresh me'atzmo u'maskim lahalacha. He says, because speaking about himself, Rebbe Tarfon, he says, Tarfon was an eyewitness, but even though I was an eyewitness, I forgot the circumstances, I forgot the details. And sometimes, even though you see something with your own eyes, you sometimes don't remember all of the details behind the story. But Akiva, you were never there. You never saw what was going on in the temple, but you are more correct than I, who was an eyewitness at what happened during the times of the Second Temple. Ha kol haporesh mimcha kiporesh mechayav. And we see from here, concludes Rabbi Tarfon, that anyone who dissents from you, Rabbi Akiva, is as if he's dissenting or separating himself from life itself. And that's the conclusion of the Midrash. So going back to our story in the Haggadah, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi quoted that in this next generation, you have Rabbi Akiva, you have Rabbi Tarfon, you have Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Notice that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are also reclining together in Bnei Brak at that same Seder in the Haggadah. But it certainly is clear that whereas this is a bridge generation, some of the sages are alive at the time of the Second Temple and are witness to the Churban. But it's clear that Rabbi Akiva was never an eyewitness to what happened in the temple. And that's why Rabbi Tarfon said to him, the difference between you and me, Rabbi Akiva, is that I was there, but I don't recall things correctly. You were never there, but you have a better intuition as to what the correct halacha should be about what should protocol in the temple. Okay, so I just wanted to bring across that point. And this is the last thing I'm going to mention about this bridge generation is the following. And I want to accentuate a very important contrast in the difference, the generational attitudes, how they shift in a very, very short period of time. If you go back to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, you'll notice that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to his 5 students, after the Mishnah lists the 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and after it lists their virtues, what each one was known for a different midah, for a different attribute, Amar Lahem, the Mishnah then states that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to those 5 disciples, Se'u ure'u, go out and see. Ezohi derech yeshara sheyidbak baha adam. I want you to examine and discover what is this correct path that a person should attach himself or herself to. Now, it's a very interesting instruction. It's a very interesting directive that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells his students. First of all, se'u ur'u. Se'u ur'u, go out and see. We do have that language also about going out. We have it in the Haggadah as well. Does anyone remember where we have that idea of going out? Where does that appear in the Haggadah? Anybody?
Say ulmad.
Say ulmad, yafeh. Right, exactly. Go out and learn, right? Whenever you find the term say or tse'u, it implies that you got to lift up your head from your book and you've got to actually look out into the real world. And this is a directive that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells his 5 disciples. And as a matter of fact, the Avodas Yisrael, the Apter Rav, in his commentary to this Mishnah, makes it the actual point of saying that. He says, Amar lahem tse'u ur'u, ezahu derech tova shidbak ha'adam perush, tse'u mimadregatchem lahabit bihitztarchut ha'olam. What he was telling his students to do is, Kiberlach, I know that you feel you need to devote yourselves, especially during this very fragile period of time that the temple has now been destroyed. You need to redouble your efforts in becoming Talmidei Chachamim, in becoming great scholars. But no, I need you to leave your madrega. What does the word madrega mean? Leave your spiritual levels. You're going to perforce have to demote yourselves from your immersion in spiritual and holy affairs and look at the needs of the world. And what it means essentially is that every rabbinic leader comes to a crossroads in his life at some point where he has to ask himself the question, what is my priority? To enrich myself with Talmud Torah and with holy endeavors, or to go out and pastor to the rest of Klal Yisrael, to attend to the needs of my fellow brethren? That's the question. And what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was explicitly instructing these particular 5 disciples, because he recognized within them that each one had a unique ability to impact their generation which needed their leadership, he said, I need for you to leave your lofty levels of spiritual immersion and focus on the needs of the world right now. Your fellow Jews are broken. They need your assistance right now. Today, I'm going to put a little bit of an interlude right at this point. Today is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha. It's the first yahrzeit. We lost a giant in Torah and rabbinic leadership a year ago. And the Jewish world is still reeling from his loss, and his Torah still reverberates. And Sfasaim Dovavot Bakever, as our sages say, that a person really remains animated even in the grave when people quote his Torah. And Rabbi Sachs was fond of creating this sense of kindred spirits with the Lubavitcher Rebbe quite often, where he basically pointed out that the Rebbe felt that the mission of Jews, especially in the 20th century and beyond, was to go out and make sure that their fellow Jews were attended to. And he says there are good leaders and there are great leaders. The Rebbe was a great leader because a great leader makes other leaders. And that's what the Rebbe was great at doing. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai felt was the imperative for these particular 5 students of his was to make sure that they would lead the Jewish communities. You need to close your Sfarim, go out into the world, and make sure that you are attending to the needs of the masses, even if it means that you have to demote yourselves from your holy level. So that is the imperative of the generation that has been witness to the Churban Beit HaMikdash. Is everybody with me? Now, I want us to move to the Haggadah for just a moment. We have the same Rebbe Eliezer. We have the same Rebbe Yehoshua, who are part of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's 5 disciples. But this is probably, there's a gap of time between this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot and this story in the Haggadah. The story in the Haggadah is clearly taking place later because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is probably no longer alive, and you have a group of the most elite of the rabbinic community who are reclining in Bnei Brak. You have the vestiges of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students, plus you have the new generation, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon is also vestigial from the Second Temple, and he's also a participant in this Seder as well. Now notice there's something that's easy to miss in this story. They're reclining all night in Bnei Brak, discussing the esoteric ideas of Yetziat Mitzrayim for the entire night. We don't know what they were talking about, but it must have been very, very lofty. Until the students came in and told them, Rabotenu, Higia Zman Kriya Shema Shel Shachars. Our masters, it's come time, the morning has broken, it's time to recite the Shema. Now, there's a question that I once saw the Mujitzer Rebbe ask, and when you think about the question, the Ritva asked this question as well. Where were the students the whole night of the Seder? I mean, if you had an opportunity to have these 5 great rabbis reclining in Bnei Brak, can you imagine today, if this was going to happen, you know what they would be doing? They'd put out bleachers for thousands and thousands of students, like with the Rebbe's Tish in the middle, and you'd have them all listening to the rabbis discussing Yetzias Mitzrayim the whole night. But that's not what happened. This was a very private Seder with just these 5 rabbis, and the students come in only in the morning to tell them, Rabosenu Higia Zman Kriya Shema Shel Shachars. Why were the students excluded from the Seder? Why do they only come in the morning? There are a number of answers to this question, but what I do want to point out, and what it seems to me to be something that's very important to observe from this, is that when you are dealing with this bridge that is being forged between the generation of the Churban and the generation post-Churban, there is this longing and this need that people like Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah have to cling to the past generation. to yearn, to not to what's the word I'm looking for? To nurture, to nourish themselves, and to gain nourishment from the teachings of those who were alive at the time of the destruction of the temple. And that's why I believe that Rebbi Akiva said, there's a time for us to teach Torah to our students, but there's also a time for us to enrich ourselves by learning from our elder sages, so that we will be able to be so enriched that when the time when the time comes, we will be able to pass on the baton to our students. But in order for us to do that, we first need to close the door and spend time alone with these great venerated sages that are older than us, that were witness to the Churban, and then we can move on and pass it on to our students. And so you're seeing a bit of a shift. You're seeing that in the generation of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Hoshua as students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he gives them the charge, go out, even though it means reducing yourselves on some level, but your responsibility is to the masses. And just a few years later, when the next generation who was not witness to the Churban comes along, we see them closing the door behind them and excluding their students, because there are times when we need to strengthen ourselves first to gain whatever can be passed on to us from the previous generation. And only once we've enriched ourselves can we pass it on to the next generation. And I think that that's the deeper meaning of this passage of the Haggadah. The students came to them and said, Rabotenu higiyazman kriyat shema shel shacharis. You've spent enough time in the nighttime looking back at the great darkness of the Churban and of the yesteryear, the Second Temple. Now dawn has come, and we are facing a new frontier. Now we need you. Now that you've spent so much time with your teachers, open the door, come out to us, your students, and share what you've gained from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Hoshua, and give it over to us now. And that's the deeper meaning of Rabotenu higiyazman kriya shema shel shacharis. The morning has come, the new day has arrived, and now you need to go out into the light of day and continue that project that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had asked the previous generation to do, and spread that message. So I'm going to, we can continue this idea as well, but Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah continues the discussion. He's living after the Churban. He's one of the 5 students that are reclining, or 5 rabbis reclining in Bnei Brak, and he says, I did not fully appreciate the fact that you're supposed to recite the Haggadah during the nighttime. And the Chachamim say, no, that you only recite it during the daytime. And this could also be part of the disputation. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah initially thought that you only have to focus on the day, the new day, but you also have to recite the Haggadah at night and look backwards and look behind you and look at the times of darkness. Lahavdil, it's almost like the generation of the Holocaust, who went through, as Elie Wiesel, as we all know, characterized that in his book called Night. That was the night in our period of modern Jewish history. And that was the nighttime. And there are many of us who recognized and still recognize that we are rapidly losing all of the eyewitnesses to the Shoah. And so we need to cling to them and gain their testimonies and gain as much information from them. But then there does come a time when the students come and they say, Higiyazman kriya shema shel shacharis, now it's time to share that with the younger generation. And people of my age, children of survivors, recognize that we are in that gap generation, that bridge generation between those who survived the Shoah, those who went through the night of the Churban of Europe, and those of and our children who need us to take what we've gained from our parents who went through the Shoah and pass it on to them. And that's why this passage in the Haggadah is so resonant for people of our generation because we recognize Rebbe Eliezer and Rebbe Yehoshua were at the Seder. Those are our parents. And we have to spend time with them and cherish those moments that we can, savor those moments and hold on to them as long as we can until our children come to us and say, and our grandchildren come to us and say, okay, it's the new day. Share with us what you've learned. Spend time with us and give us what you've learned from your parents. So this is an important point. I know it's not necessarily what Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is trying to communicate to us, but I wanted to share it with you nonetheless. Now you're going to see that in the ensuing paragraph, Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is going to focus on this passage of the four sages who entered into the Pardes, entered into this orchard of some kind of esoteric contemplation. They are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rebbe Akiva. Ben Zoma is also mentioned in this passage with Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah and Rebbe Akiva and Rebbe Tarfon. So you see that he is also a contemporary of this new generation. And we're going to focus on, in our next discussion of Kuzari, we're going to focus on this passage in Tractate Chagiga of the Arba Shenichnasu Pardes, the four who entered into the orchard. But that's enough for now. And we're going to go and transition out to Parshat Chayei Sarah. Before I do so, any questions or comments in what we've discussed in the Kuzari today? Okay. Our Dvar Torah for Parshas Chayei Sarah is a time for philosophizing, a time for action. Judaism is an amazing religion. We spend half our time studying and thinking and talking about God, talking about the purpose of life. And we spend the other half, I don't know if it's really half and half, but we spend a lot of our time doing mitzvot. And sometimes we have a hard time in sort of trying to infuse our thinking with action and infusing our action with thinking. But what I want to point out today is that sometimes you need to have a healthy complement of both in order to be a fully well-developed servant of God. We know the story that Sarah dies in Kiryat Arba in Hebron at the age of 127. The Torah says, "Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota," that Avraham came to eulogize Sarah, to cry for her. And the very next pasuk says, "Vayakam Avraham me'al penei meto," that Avraham abruptly arises. In other words, the Torah doesn't tell us what his hesped was. The Torah doesn't tell us what eloquent words he must have recited at Sarah's levaya. It just tells us that he abruptly gets up after he had come to Kiryat Arba to eulogize Sarah. It says that he arises from his mourning, from being in Sarah's presence, Vayidaber el b'nei Chet lemor, and he speaks to the children of Chet, saying that he would like to purchase a burial plot for his wife Sarah and for the family, for the mishpacha, which, as we know, eventually becomes Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Now, the Medrash points out an interesting verbiage in this pasuk, Vayakam Avraham me'al penei meto, that Avraham arises from the face of his dead. So Hayalolomar me'al penei Sarah, like, is she, if you lose a beloved relative, would you say, when you get up from being in the presence of that deceased relative, that I'm getting up from my dead? Or do you say I'm getting up from, and then you say the name? Why wasn't Sarah's name mentioned? It should have said, Vayakam Avraham me'al penei Sarah. He got up from Sarah's presence to be able to deal with issues of burial. Umal tamulomar meto, klomar moto. So the Medrash says, read the word meto, his dead, as his own death. Milamed shahaya ro'eh malach hamavet omeid umatris kenegdo. That this teaches us that when Avraham was in that moment, he sees the angel of death who was there, proverbially, you can imagine, when we think of the angel of death, we think of the guy in the black hood and the scythe, because we're used to seeing Fellini movies and images of mythology, right? But the fact is, we don't know what the Malach HaMavis looks like, the angel of death. But the angel of death is right there taunting and tormenting Avraham at that moment as he's dealing with, mourning for his wife. Now, that's all the Medrash tells us. And the Medrash repeats itself in another Medrash in Bereshit Rabbah. And then right afterwards, in the second version of the Medrash, it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ma hein taninan, min hein taninan. From this we learn, mi shemeto mutalefanav, that when a person is in the presence of their dead, patur mikriya shema umin hatfila umin hatfilin b'chol mitzvot Shabbat Torah. That you see from this whole story that when you are in the midst of just now experiencing a fresh death in the family, a person is called an one. And we know that an one is in a state where he is exempt from davening, from reciting Kriya Shema, from putting on tefillin, and all of the mitzvot, all of the positive commandments of the Torah. Minhacha vayakam vayidaber. And we know it from the fact that even though Avraham had come to engage in some kind of service for Sarah, but everything is interrupted abruptly when he sees the owners of the property and he says, I got to take care of Sarah's burial. Nothing else is important. And what you learn from this is that all of one's religious obligations or duties are suspended when you have to take care of the burial of the dead. And that's how we learn the laws of aninut, of when a person has just suffered a death, that they are completely absolved from all religious duties and are supposed to be exclusively focused on taking care of just the mundane physical needs of the burial. And that's where you see it from, because again, Avraham initially was indulging in his loss, crying, eulogizing, and all of a sudden he gets up, says, dries his tears, and everything is put on hold because the most important thing right now, I've got to take care of Sarah's burial. Okay, and that's the din of an one. That's the law of an one. Now, there's something deeper here that I and this is the point that I want to share with you all today. And in order to bring across this point, I want to share with you a piece from the Tiferet Shlomo, Reb Shlomo HaKohen Rabinovich of Radomsk, the first Radomsker Rav, who lived in the 19th century. And he quotes the Medrash, and he states as follows: Hanir'eh b'veur hamidrash, ki l'cha'ora ein lahavin ma haya kashe lo lebal hamidrash hazeh ve'ich muchach min hamikra hazeh. First of all, we first have to understand where we derive this idea that the Malach HaMavis was there tormenting Avraham. What was the Malach HaMavis tormenting Avraham with? He says, Achein hanira li bekavanat hamidrash, ki yesh ladaat bahakatuv shene'amar, vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'liv kota. Because the verse says that Avraham came to eulogize Sarah and to cry for her. V'lo ne'emar sha'asa kein v'hispida. It doesn't say that he actually did eulogize her, but rather, but it says that he abruptly got up, which seems that even though he had initially come for the purpose of eulogizing Sarah in her presence, he interrupted everything. The Medrash is telling us that the thing that interrupted him was the Malach HaMavis. It was the angel of death said, stop. So what does it mean? What does it mean that the angel of death interrupted Avraham's activity of eulogizing his wife? So he says that there's something very deep going on over here. He says, Vayinyanhu al derech hakatuv vayaster Moshe panav ki yarei mehabit el ha'elokim. He says, in order to appreciate what's going on, I want to reference another completely different passage in the Torah having to do with Moshe's encounter with the burning bush. When Moshe first sees the burning bush and he comes close, the Torah says that when he sees the bush burning, it says that Moshe hides his face because he recognized that he was in the presence of God, and he hid his face out of fear for looking at God directly. That's what the pasuk itself says. V'rotzeh lomar, but on a deeper level, what it really means here is Dihinei ze klal gadol b'ma'alot hatzadikim hamitalchim lifnei Elokim b'tamim. He says, because when a person is truly righteous and follows the way of God with innocence and with purity, af im chalila ba'a eleihem midat hadin le'eze yachido rabim chas v'shalom, that if, God forbid, tragedy strikes, if, God forbid, a calamity happens, whether it's to a community of people or to an individual, lo yitnu libam lihitbonein mahu tatzara hahi rachmana litzlan. The tzaddik does not indulge in focusing on the theological causes and the whys and the wherefores of why this tragedy occurred. V'lo yipol levavam lahakshot madua asa Hashem kacha la'aretz hazot. That the tzaddik does not start asking questions. Why, God? Why did you bring this tragedy? Why did you cause this? Ki libam nachonu batuach b'Hashem, because the tzaddik's heart is already resonant with God, and the tzaddik recognizes ki tzaddik v'yasharhu kelamuna vein avel. He says because the tzaddik recognizes that God is just and upright, and everything that Hashem does has a reason, and is actually a legitimate thing. You know, Rabbi Sachs was quoted as saying, why bad things happen to good people. I just saw this very small clip of him this morning. When he was asked, why do bad things happen to people? His response was, he says, we don't know the answer, and God doesn't want us to know the answer. Because if we knew the answer, we would stop fighting. And Hashem wants us to fight against evil. Hashem wants us to fight against all tragedy and calamity, and to daven when someone is sick, and to try and ask Hashem to put a stop to it. That's why we've been put here on this world. But when the tragedy does strike, the tzaddik also acknowledges that everything has happened for a reason. And therefore he continues and says, Ulekach ba'oto ha'inyan kasher ra'a Moshe Rabbeinu mar'eh hasneh hamoreh al hagalut v'lo ratza lihitbonein mazeh ve'al mazeh. That's the deeper meaning of when it says that Moshe hid his face from Elokim, which represents the God of retribution, which represents the God of justice, which represents the God who sends us into exile. Moshe says, I don't want to focus on that right now. I understand that there are going to be times when God is going to be very stern, a stern God of justice, but I'm turning away from that now's not the time to deal with it. Ach vayaster panav ki arei mehabitu lihistakel el bechinat ha'elokim v'hadinin pen yikshev ve'einav al kacha. And Moshe said, now's not the time. If there's something that needs to be done to help Klal Yisrael, now's not the time to wax theologically and to start questioning God. Why are you bringing this suffering upon your people? Now's not the time. And he points out, then the one time that Moshe broke character and actually started questioning God at the end of Parshat Shemot, God punished him. He says, now's not the time to start asking questions. We need you to take action. And Moshe initially realized that. And that's why it says that he hid his face. He says, I know that there are a lot of questions, but sometimes you need to hide your face from those questions because you're needed at the moment to intervene and to be a person of action. And now gives us a deeper insight into the verse which says, who is the person who desires life, who loves days to see good? So what is the meaning of that verse? Mi hatzadik Asher kol hayamim ro'eh ki hakol rak tov me Hashem yitbarach. Who is a tzaddik? A person who sees that everything that happens is good and comes from Hashem. As mimela al yedei kain, if he's able to reach that level of acknowledging that everything happens for a reason, yinsor l'shano meira, he will guard his tongue from evil, and he will never start disparaging God himself and questioning why God. Why are you doing this? Ki lo yera be'einav klal al Hashem yisbarach. So guarding your tongue from evil is not just not speaking lashon hara. Guarding your tongue from evil is when you are truly a tzaddik and you want to see good your entire life, you recognize that even though there are many questions that linger, but I still ultimately appreciate and recognize that everything that Hashem does is for a reason. V'hinei, now we get to the punchline, so to speak, and we get to the conclusion of what's going on in this passage. Kain hadavar haya etzel Avraham Avinu. This is what Avraham Avinu is undergoing at this very moment of Sarah's death. Keshabal lispod l'Sarah, ra'a malach hamaves matris kenegdo rachmana litzlan. He says that this is what it means when the malach hamaves came to taunt Avraham. Kishihitchil hitbonen al mitat Sarah hatzadeket harishona asher ba'olam. Avraham Avinu is starting to think about the fact that my wife Sarah, the first Jewess, the first righteous woman of my generation, has now passed from this world. Asher hayta aim kol b'nei Yisrael, v'tikun chava. She is the matriarch of all of the Jewish people. She represents the rectification of Chava, the first woman's sin. She represents V'ruach HaKodesh medaberet mitoch grona, that the Spirit of God spoke through her. God said that everything that Sarah tells you, listen to her, because she has this great level of prophecy. Ve'ata pitom meta alav, acharei ma'alat ha'akeda, and now all of a sudden she dies, after I've had this great epiphanous experience of bringing my son on the Akedah. Shezachta leven tzadik kazeh v'lo ho'ila klum. He says, after all of this holy thing has happened, where I've gone through the trial, my son Yitzchak has emerged as a tzaddik, and none of this has saved Sarah from death, even though she was so holy, and her husband was holy, her son was holy, and yet she still dies. At that, just shortly after the Akedah, Kol zeh haya hayetzer hara machnis b'libo shel Avraham Avinu. All of these arguments, why God? How can this happen to such a holy person, to such a good person, such a righteous person? All of these questions begin swirling in Avraham's mind. That's the Malach HaMavis taunting Avraham with all of these questions. That's what it means that the Malach HaMavis came and started taunting him. Leva'avur yukshe ve'einav v'yeira al ma'aseh Elokim asher asala, because the Malach HaMaves or the Yetzer Hara, they're the same entity, wants Avraham to start having questions. Lachein kishara az miyad piresh v'lo hispida. But that's when Avraham said, you know what, if I start delving too much into my loss and indulging in my sorrow and eulogizing Sarah and talking about how righteous of a woman she was, I'm just going to become theologically perplexed, and I may even start questioning God. And so now's the time for me to get up. Vayakam me'al pnei meito vayidaber dvarim acherim. And basically, just like Moshe hid his face, Avraham said, Genikshoin, now's not the time. I need to focus on the lamaisa, the tachlis of my Yiddishkeit. And I've spoken about this in a different context. Maybe we'll come back to this when we go to Parshas Vayishlach and we talk about the wrestling match that Yaakov has with Esav's angel. And when the morning comes, Yaakov says, the angel says to Yaakov, Shalcheni ki Allah hashachar, it's time for us to stop. We need to move on. We need to go on from here. Yaakov realizes that after all of the struggle, the theological struggling that he's had with this angel, now the new morning has come and we need to daven shacharis. In other words, the point being is that there's a time for theological wrangling and theological questioning and indulging in the great important questions that perplex us and that plague us many times. But there's also a time of vayakam me'al penei meta, that you have to get up and you have to say, no, now's not the time because I'm too distraught, I'm too upset, and perhaps I need to engage myself in the mitzvot right now because that's what's important at this moment. I think that's the deeper reason why an onen is exempt from Kriyat Shema and from all of the other prayer mitzvot, is because Kriyat Shema is a required affirmation of God and you can start having thoughts. You've just suffered a tremendous loss, and now all of a sudden you're asked to recite Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. It might be difficult for a person. You're telling me to recite Shema, and I have to start thinking about God's unity, and everything that God does is for the good. And you know what? Maybe not everyone is ready to do that at that very, very difficult moment. So we exempt you, not only because you got to take care of the flights and all of the prosaic needs of the burial, but also because now's not the time for you to start dwelling with your thoughts, because you may end up going down the wrong hole. And so therefore, the rabbis in their wisdom said, no davening, focus on taking care of the prosaic needs. And when it's during Shiva, you'll be able to indulge in your sorrow, but by then, hopefully, you'll have a greater level of acceptance of what has happened, and you'll be able to create some kind of reconciliation for yourself as to why this has all happened. But in that shocking first moment of where you want to engage in your sorrow, stop. Don't engage in anything that could perhaps cause you to question God. And that's the reason why the Medrash infers from these verses that Avram had to stand up and stop eulogizing Sarah, because it was a time for action, not a time for theology or philosophizing or anything like that. And it's important to know that that's why Yiddishkeit is a well-rounded religion. We have to be able to know that there are going to be times when it's not easy for us to answer the big questions, but the fact that we are left with questions does not mean that we leave Judaism. It's just the opposite. When we're left with those great questions, we have to pick ourselves up and do the chesed, do the mitzvah, take care of communal needs, go to minyan, whatever the situation demands of us, because sometimes the action of doing goodness in the world is sometimes the more pressing need, and hopefully through our good actions, some of those pressing questions they may never be resolved, but at least they'll be put in their proper context, and we'll be able to continue living and being faithful people despite all the questions that linger in our minds. But they'll be contextualized in the life of humans. Okay, that's the point that I wanted to communicate today. And I want to wish you all a wonderful day. We're already coming up to the hour, so I've spoken a little bit too much. Anyway, have a wonderful day, everybody, and talk to you soon.
Thank you. You too, Rebbi.